everybody. Welcome to the Silver Bullets podcast. I am Michael Citro.
And I'm Chip Minnick.
And Chip, it looked a little touch and go for us for a while. It didn't seem like we were going to be able to finish our season with some internet difficulties. This is not the ideal sound that people have come to know and expect, but we'll make it work. I'm glad that I finally got a hold of you.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm not sure what's going on, but like you just said, I'm glad that we're able to connect.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be our last podcast of the Silver Bullets until the spring game. We'll wrap up the season a little bit here and, talk about some of the happenings since last week and kind of sort of put a pin in the Silver Bullets for now. And so I guess my first item for discussion is, this is going to be a question where it seems painfully obvious to me, and the answer will seem painfully obvious to everybody, but not everybody will have the same painfully obvious answer to it, depending on if you are, mega spoiled or a realist or whatever. But the question that I want to discuss first is one that I think the answer is yes for me, pretty blatantly. But was this a successful 2019 Ohio State football season?
Oh, absolutely, resoundingly so. I think and nobody is happy with the way it ended and the circumstances that everyone is familiar with. But without a question, it has to be a successful season. I mean, I said it before at the beginning of the season. I will reiterate it, that I think the measure of a successful season is for Ohio State to win the Big Ten championship. And I realize it doesn't have the same cachet as it did when you and I were growing up. But for Ryan Day in his first year as Ohio State's head coach to win the Big Ten championship, get Ohio State back to the college football playoff, defeat that team up north, absolutely, it's a resounding success.
Yeah, there was a time, and it doesn't seem that long ago, although I'm sure it is long ago, that just one win defined the entire season of whether or not it was successful, regardless of what else happened in the course of the season, the Big Ten schedule and whatnot. But that was beat Michigan, and it's a successful season. That was it. That was the only criteria that Ohio State had for a successful season. Now, there were obviously degrees of success. Do you beat that team up north and also win the conference, or also go to the Rose Bowl and those kinds of things? That those kind of came along with it. But generally speaking, if you beat Michigan, it was a successful season. If you were you won 7 games, but one of them was the Michigan game, that was considered a win. And I know that expectations have changed, and we've had it so good for so long that now a single loss season seems to some people like it's not successful, and it seems kind of ridiculous to think that when there are so few teams that can get through their schedules, no matter what their schedules are, with one loss or 2 losses even. I mean, 9-3 was a pretty standard season for Ohio State not that long ago.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you and I think we're part of that generation where we remembered with Earl Bruce and then John Cooper, especially with John Cooper, that, okay, a win over the Wolverines was few and far between. I mean, over a 13-year span, Ohio State went 2-10-1. And to put it in context, Ohio State has been even more dominant over the Wolverines than they ever were, for 13 years under John Cooper. So you just said, 9-3. That was the unfortunate moniker labeled around Coach Bruce for his tenure. But I distinctly remember there was a time when a win over the Wolverines was not a sure thing. A win in the bowl game was not a sure thing. Being in the top 20 was considered, all right, that was kind of especially in the early years of John Cooper's tenure, was not necessarily a guarantee. So the fact that Ohio State has been routinely beating their rival, third year in a row winning the Big Ten championship, as I said a moment ago, being in the college football playoff, is already being discussed as a possible college football playoff participant for 2020. I think without a doubt Ohio State had a successful season. I'm not happy with the way it ended. I certainly wish that Ohio State was still playing, but I think anyone who would look at this and say, oh, that was not a successful season because they're not playing for the national championship has to reevaluate what they define success, because they're probably very, very miserable most of the time if that's the barometer that they use.
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing for anyone to live up to that, and you see it in social media. You see what entitlement does to people. You look at Alabama fans when their team loses one game, and it's kind of the same thing. It's like they expect to be in the championship, playing for the championship every year. It's not necessarily realistic. Very few teams can get more than a few years that are at the very, very pinnacle. I mean, it's a very rarefied air. But I mean, you and I both know that some of those 9-3 Earl Bruce teams felt better than 10-2 John Cooper teams because of that win over Michigan.
Oh, certainly, without a doubt. I mean, it was the kind of thing where, as you said, Earl Bruce definitely, say what you will about, the offense was predictable, or he was too exclusively oriented towards Ohio players, and John Cooper made Ohio State a national program. You can say all those things, but one thing you cannot deny is that Earl Bruce understood the consequences and the ramifications of losing or winning the game, and that was something that was lost for a 13-year span. So I'm happy to be standing here, the fact that when it came time for Coach Cooper to be replaced, that one of Coach Bruce's former assistants, Jim Tressel, completely understood the magnitude of the rivalry, and another one of Coach Bruce's former coaches, at least as a graduate assistant, and Coach Meyer, did as well, and Coach Meyer has successfully passed down that legacy to Ryan Day presently.
Yeah, it was a tremendous season. I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said you weren't happy the way it ended. I think a lot of us weren't happy with the way it ended, and I think a lot of us would be okay. We wouldn't love it, but I think a lot of people would be okay if the game against Clemson had kind of gone similarly to how it went, but without the controversial calls. Like let's say that Sean Wade gets a roughing the passer call instead of a targeting call, and same effect stays. But he stays in the game, and then Clemson goes on to score and whatnot, and maybe let's say there's no such thing as the overturned scoop and score. Maybe that play doesn't even happen. Maybe it's just maybe Trevor Lawrence throws that ball 5 yards over the head of his receiver and it's completely incomplete. I think that it's a completely different feeling to that loss.
Oh, without question. I think you have it accurate when you say it was the fact that it was a loss, but the contributing factors. Just kind of what's that expression, like pouring salt in the wound? I mean, that's basically what those contributing factors, like the controversial calls that went against Ohio State, that is what is making the loss even greater or worse in the psyches of the collective Ohio State fan base.
And it's not just salt in the wounds. This is an open wound that you stick in a hot pepper jar.
Well, that's quite the visual, and quite the. I'm kind of grimacing. You can't see me, but I'm kind of just thinking that would just, have me just, writhing in pain and misery. But I think you've got it perfectly summarized.
So the Buckeyes go 13-1 overall, 9-0 in the conference. in the conference regular season play, plus the win over Wisconsin. Let's walk back through the season a little bit. The Buckeyes opened with a 45-21 win over Florida Atlantic back on August 31st, and this was a game where little did we know. We didn't know a whole lot about this team at that point. We weren't sure that the defense was fixed with Florida Atlantic scoring 21 points. Little did we know the Buckeyes would not give up 21 points again until mid-November. That was against Rutgers, but the team went then against Cincinnati. We all kind of looked at that game coming into the season as certainly as the best opponent in the non-conference schedule, a potential upset, some people would say. I think you yourself had thought that Cincinnati had a good shot to win this game, and the Buckeyes just went out and flattened them 42-0.
Yeah, and let's, just to kind of put things in perspective, when you talked about Florida Atlantic, the concern was, and it's very difficult to conceive of it now, but at the time, Justin Fields was not necessarily, did not have the full 100% confidence of the fan base based on his performance in the spring game. And that's not always an accurate representation of how somebody is going to do, when you're talking about how the spring game is set up. But that first game against Florida Atlantic, who also turned out to be a decent team throughout the course of the 2019 season, that was great to see. And you're right, I did think Cincinnati was going to be a much more difficult game than they turned out to be. As it was, Cincinnati wound up being a very good team within their conference. So Ohio State was off to a very productive 2-0 start against what turned out to be two very good teams in 2019.
Yep. The next opponent was the first conference opponent. This was a trip to Bloomington, first road game for Justin Fields. To Indiana, a place where Indiana, a lot of people say, well, Indiana's been giving Ohio State trouble in recent years. Indiana proved to be a good team this year by going to a bowl game and really coming within a missed extra point and a missed field goal of winning. And the Hoosiers were on the wrong end of a 51-10 thrashing.
Yeah, and that was also a positive of that game was the play of Damon Arnett, who was, let's just say it. I mean, Damon Arnett was a popular target of online, I don't want to say harassment, but ridicule by the fans.
He was a whipping boy,
for his inconsistent play, and that interception he returned for a touchdown. That was a nice thing to see for somebody who wound up being a very strong contributor to Ohio State in 2019.
The Buckeyes came home to play Miami, and nobody was really too concerned about Miami, and the Buckeyes certainly showed why with a 76-5 win over Miami, although it was 5-0 at one point the other direction. Miami, it really, nobody got too excited about that win, but it turned out Miami wasn't a bad team. They went on to win the MAC.
Right, and Miami is playing tonight in the Lending Tree Bowl. One of those bowl games that, I'm sure that everyone else is camped around the television. I can't miss the Lending Tree Bowl. But what I will always remember about that Miami game is not only did they actually lead 5-0, but even their head coach, Chuck Martin, prior to the game said that this was kind of like if you were going out to pick teams at recess, that Ohio State got the first 85 selections. That Miami came into it fully aware of the magnitude and the quality of the opponent that they were going to be facing. For a brief moment, they led Ohio State, but it did kind of turn out the way everyone had anticipated. I can't recall what the line was by the odds makers, but Ohio State had little to no problem dealing with Miami whatsoever.
Yeah, I don't think it was a 71-point spread.
No, I would say not, but I bet you if we were to go back, I bet you it was probably at least like a 45, 50, something like that.
I would guess it was probably in the low 40s. That would be my guess. But 71.
That's fine. Yeah, somebody can point that. They can correct us for sure.
I just want to tell you, Chip, I have fond memories as when I was a child growing up with my dad, and we would always make plans every year to make sure we were, snuggled up on the couch to watch the Lending Tree Bowl. It was a family tradition.
Well, okay, I'll say this much. I'm glad that you have those fond memories, but it's certainly it's certainly no Poulan Weed Eater Independence Bowl. That's all I could say.
So the Buckeyes ended up going back on the road to Lincoln, and this was the one everyone circled as this is going to be the game, the one that they always lose to a Big Ten West opponent. This year it's going to be Nebraska, and Ohio State went out and won that one 48-7. So again, every time we kept saying something was going to be tougher and tougher, it wasn't tougher.
Prior to the season, and this, just because it's one of the things that near the end of our show, we always talk about how people can find us on the internet. For Athlon Sports, I had been asked, among other contributors to Athlon Sports, to predict Ohio State's win-loss record, and I freely admitted that I thought Nebraska was going to be the loss. That it seemed likely that okay, you were talking a night game. As you said, Ohio State has in recent years shown an inclination to lose a game to a Big Ten West opponent. Nebraska certainly seemed capable of doing it, and I could not have been further from the truth with like you said, just the resounding victory that Ohio State had at Nebraska.
Scott Frost might get Nebraska where we think he can get it, but he certainly did not quite get it there this year. And the Buckeyes win handily by 41 points and then go home to play the Spartans, a team that has actually been better against the Buckeyes in Columbus than in East Lansing in recent years. But the Buckeyes, again, not too much of a problem, winning 34-10 at home. And really, that was when you knew that the team could play and score points against just about any defense.
Certainly. And I think it's fair to say that, and again, we're recording this in early January, and you can politely remind me next fall when Ohio State does go to East Lansing, and I probably get nervous and anxious about it, but it might be fair to say that Ohio State has exercised a lot of those demons that seem to plague them whenever they would take on the Spartans of Michigan State.
After that, it was a rematch of last year's Big Ten championship game with the Buckeyes going to Northwestern. We knew this was going to be a very different Northwestern team. The Wildcats had some quarterback issues. They had not won very many games to this point. And sure enough, the Wildcats, it was like watching you remember the Jim Tressel years when it was almost like somebody at Northwestern must have done something wrong to Jim Tressel at some point, because he used to punish them with extreme prejudice year after year, and that's what this was like, a 52-3 win for Ohio State.
That's a really good point. Jim Tressel did seem to have something against Northwestern, and what I will also remember from this game was that it was played, much to my consternation, on a Friday night, which is, in my humble opinion, sacred for high school football in the great state of Ohio. But Ohio State, that was not their choice. I mean, they had to do what the Big Ten had decided to allow when it came to the television contract. So, yeah, Ohio State was extremely dominant in that game, that Friday night game at Northwestern.
Yes, no more Fridays, please. And then the Buckeyes came home to face Wisconsin and won 38-7. And this was the fourth game in what we thought was going to be a 4-game gauntlet when we talked about this in the preseason podcast. At Nebraska, home to Michigan State, at Northwestern, home to Wisconsin. That seemed like a very difficult 4-game stretch, and Ohio State won by 172 to 27.
Yeah, and that Wisconsin game, that was also a showcase effort for Chase Young. Now, granted, this was one of those many big noon contests on Fox. I know a lot of Ohio State fans were very upset at the fact that Ohio State did not get its routine share of night games, but Chase Young, he didn't seem to care what time the game kicked off because he was routinely dominating the opponents that were lined up against him, and especially in that Wisconsin game.
Yeah, and that was really the Chase Young for Heisman coming out moment. Gus Johnson and Joel Klatt were very effusive in their praise, and a lot of people around the country, a lot of national people started thinking Chase Young was the best player in the country. And that quickly went away because Chase Young then missed the next two games with a suspension, as it was revealed that he had borrowed some money from a family friend that he had known since before he enrolled at Ohio State, had paid back that loan, trying to get his girlfriend out to the Rose Bowl last year. And, of course, we can't have that. That is just unethical. Chase Young gets to sit for two games. And in those two games, Ohio State did okay. They beat Maryland 73-14 in Columbus, then went to Rutgers, and really didn't play like they were all that bothered about playing the Scarlet Knights, and still beat them 56-21.
Yeah, the Maryland game, that was another one where there was a lot of suspicion that Ryan Day. We talked earlier about how Jim Tressel used to have something against Northwestern. It certainly seemed the way Ohio State thrashed Maryland that there might have been something there, but yeah, they had little to no problem dealing with Maryland or Rutgers during that two-game stretch.
Yeah, it was. That's why a lot of people thought that Maryland may have been responsible for the Chase Young news that broke, and they said there was nothing to that. Ohio State said there was nothing to that. Ohio State just went out and beat the crap out of Maryland, and a lot of teams did that after the first few games of the season. Not necessarily to the tune of 73-14, but there you go. So here we come to the end of the season. Chase Young is back, and Ohio State has another gauntlet to run, this time Penn State, Michigan, and if they get by those two schools, another date with Wisconsin, as it turned out, although at that time it looked like it was going to be Minnesota and even potentially Iowa. The 23rd came, and Penn State came to Columbus. Ohio State wins that one 28-17. A little bit more of a difficult game than I think we expected, but Ryan Day played a very conservative game, and just a very fateful game, because late in that game, that was when Justin Fields took the hit that ended up spraining his MCL. We did not know that at the time, but the Buckeyes then were going into the Michigan game undefeated after that 28-17 win.
Yeah, and Penn State, we're already hearing rumblings, at least I should say, seeing the speculation that next year when Ohio State, when they travel to Penn State, that's going to be the annual whiteout game, and of course it'll be at night because that's how Penn State likes to do it. Whereas Ohio State had to take on Penn State in that noon hour on Fox. So it's Penn State. The talent level is not nearly as vast as some other Big Ten teams, but Ohio State certainly showed that they were capable of handling the Nittany Lions at home.
Yeah, I think that game at in Happy Valley should be a big nude Saturday game. Turnabout is fair play, I say. So the rivalry game came, and this year it was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Chip, this was the year that Jim Harbaugh was finally going to get that win. By the way, that win over Penn State clinched the Big Ten East for Ohio State. So the Buckeyes go into Michigan and have to play in the Big House. And, of course, this is going to be the year. Finally, Jim Harbaugh is going to get it done. But no, Ohio State wins 56-27, clinches the undefeated season outright Big Ten East championship date with Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game. And somewhere somebody opened a Jim Harbaugh 0-5 pint house.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I said a moment ago about the talent gap, it certainly doesn't look like that is getting any closer for the Wolverines. I think Ohio State, in terms of their recruiting, in terms of just their approach to that game, is completely different than up in Ann Arbor. And I just think it's going to be like that for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, well, even the assistant coaches that came over from Michigan said this was a lot more serious from the Ohio State perspective than it was from the Michigan perspective, and they were surprised by just how vehement the Buckeyes are in their, and how seriously they take the rivalry as opposed to Michigan, and that's why you have the lopsided success right now.
Certainly, I agree.
So the Big Ten championship game comes, and again, Ohio State has just played Penn State and Michigan in back-to-back weeks. They are beaten and bruised. Justin Fields is limping around in a brace. He had a light brace in Michigan, had to put on a heavy brace because of that MCL. He had been nursing a bad thumb entering the Penn State game. As you recall, there were people that thought Justin Fields had a broken thumb and that he wasn't going to be able to play very well against Penn State and that kind of thing. So he had all this stuff going on. Wisconsin doesn't let up. They don't stop hitting. They jumped out to a big lead in this game, or a double-figure lead, 2-score lead a couple of times. And Ohio State looked to be in pretty good shape right before the half, but then gave up a long run to Jonathan Taylor, and Wisconsin scored again. And really, it wasn't until the second half that Ohio State could, finally get the offense rolling and win 34-21.
And this is where Ohio State had been ranked number one, but after the way that, I don't want to say that they struggled, but that they had to come back against Wisconsin in the second half, I think this is where the narrative, the national media narrative of which team was more deserving of being number one, that's when it switched, was as a result of the Big Ten championship game.
Yeah, and there were some chinks in Ohio State's defensive armor. I mean, I don't think anybody batted too much of an eye when Rutgers scored 21, because some of that was against the backups. Penn State put up 17, but again, they have big jump in the talent. Then Michigan puts up 27, and Wisconsin puts up 21. So then, you've got a team that went about 8 games without giving up more than 10 points. Had done it then in 4 in a row.
Certainly, yeah, and Chase Young had also been effectively neutralized down the stretch. Teams were double teaming and or outright embracing him, and kind of limiting his effectiveness as a pass rusher. So, like you said, I don't want to say that Ohio State was bad down the stretch defensively, but they weren't nearly as dominant as they were at the onset of the season.
Right. There were definitely some teams that just said, we're just going to hold him till it's called, and it never got called. I mean, you and I had talked about this previously on the show. I think after the Wisconsin game, like late in the Wisconsin game, I think was the 5th offensive holding penalty on an Ohio State opponent all season, which is, it's ludicrous. I mean, I haven't gone and done it because who has that kind of time? But I would be shocked, Chip, if any team in the Big Ten had fewer opponent offensive holding calls than Ohio State had this year.
And we always were I guess you could say, the beneficiaries of seeing how Chase Young was being, I know you talked about hands to the face that were never called. And as I said, just the outright holds and things after the game, you would see the evidence on social media, and how the officials were missing that is beyond you and I.
Yeah, I mean, these were pretty obvious. He's a defensive end, so it's right on the end of the line. You've got guys who are specifically supposed to watch that. And you and I joked that, the only explanation is that they were trying to preserve the lives of Big Ten quarterbacks. That Penn State, Michigan, Wisconsin trio of games right in a row there at the end, after Chase Young came back from that suspension, it was almost like, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not saying this is the reason. I'm saying it was almost like he was being punished further beyond the suspension by just not even batting an eye when anybody just bear hugged him. I mean, and these were not ticky tack hold calls. These were, you can go on. I mean, somebody's probably got an Imgur, or a website just devoted to this by now. But there were, you mentioned the photos on social media. I mean, these are not photos that were, these are screen captures. They're professional photography shots from the sidelines. They are full embraced bear hugs by Penn State on one of their touchdown throws. Michigan did it repeatedly. Wisconsin did it. So it was back to back to back, and it was all right after he came back. Now, some of the neutralization was legitimate. It was some double and triple teams. It was rolling away from where he was on the field. Teams did scheme to stay away from him, and in that just makes it so that the other defensive end has to have bigger games, and those didn't happen down the stretch against those better teams. So it's unfortunate that those didn't get called, because I think none of those games would have been even halfway as close as they were, and not that the Michigan game was all that close, but the Penn State and Wisconsin games, were not very lopsided. And then you go into the end of the season and you play Clemson. You beat the team that the College Football Playoff Committee says is the number 8 team in the country. You beat them by 13 points on a neutral site after beating back-to-back top 7 teams, I think. I think Penn State was in the top 5. I think Michigan was 7th or 8th when Ohio State played them. And your reward is to drop and play Clemson.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's all it does is just makes you more and more frustrated and angry. I mean, about the lack of clarity and transparency of how the decision was made. But it certainly seemed as though, like I said a few moments ago, that the Big Ten championship, that's where the narrative, the pendulum, if you will, swung decisively in favor of LSU. And in Ohio State, they were penalized for playing against a quality opponent. And like I said, it'll be something that we'll never truly comprehend.
Yeah. So Clemson came up with a new way to neutralize Chase Young. They weren't going to hold like Wisconsin and Michigan and Penn State. They were just going to flat out jam his face mask to the sky. And those hands to the face were every bit as effective as the holding penalties. Although I think that Chase Young had some effects on the game. He definitely hurried Trevor Lawrence a few times. I think Trevor Lawrence felt some footsteps. I think he helped flush Trevor Lawrence into some scrambles and into some, at least one sack by someone else. He had a half a sack taken away in that game with the Shaun Wade penalty for targeting, which I'm not even going to get into, so I can keep my blood pressure at a reasonable level. And, with the scoop and score taken off the board, the roughing instead of running into the kicker, all of those things that were, stuff that could have been called, and even stuff that we didn't see to talk about, when we discussed that game. Like, it has come to light that on the next Ohio State possession, the play that J.K. Dobbins got hurt, he was hit with the crown of the helmet in the back of his head while he was being held up by that ankle, and that was a very clear-cut targeting.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, try and keep your blood pressure down. It didn't turn out the way everyone wanted, but I want to go back to how we started this entire conversation, and that it was a successful season. It didn't end the way you or I, or especially anyone on the Ohio State Buckeyes, wanted it to end, but it was a terrific season, albeit with a lot of frustrating subplots in its conclusion.
Yep. So 29-23 was the final, and the Buckeyes finished 13-1, another 14-game season. And if you're getting 14 games in a season, you're already doing something right. So a successful season, again, a very disappointing and frustrating end to that, especially when you factor in that there were some there were some things that were outside of gameplay that went into ending that season. So, in the long run, though, the Buckeyes have a successful 2019. They built on a lot of things. And then there are a lot of things that we have learned in the last week since this season has ended. And one of the big things that we had on the docket to talk about this week that had yet been to be decided happened over the weekend, and that is that Shaun Wade has decided to return for a fourth year with the Buckeyes, which it would not have been surprising had he gone pro. We talked about the fact that he called a presser for Saturday, and generally speaking, that means that you're going to go pro. He doesn't have that much left to prove. He can improve his draft stock, but I think it had to weigh into his decision the way his college football season ended this year.
I have no doubt that the way that everything ended for Shaun Wade against Clemson certainly impacted the decision. I'm also speculating that the NFL draft board evaluation that the players were given was that he was probably told, okay, you will definitely get picked, but you might be on day 2 versus day 1. And that's not to say that, I certainly wouldn't have held it against Shaun Wade if he had gone, because it's an opportunity for him to make money. But I think he sees the opportunity to be that ringleader of a rebuilt secondary in 2020 and also improve his draft stock. I also will not be surprised if he is one of the captains of next year's team, because on the defensive side of the ball, being one of those players who can return as a starter, I think that certainly, all of those things probably weighed on his mind going into what became his decision.
Yeah, and you would have to think that right now, entering this offseason, that when they line up to start the 2020 season in the fall, that Shaun Wade's going to be an outside cornerback opposite probably Cam Brown with Amir Reep in that slot.
Yeah, I mean, you've got, I guess, and it really depends on, because we have to talk in a little bit about the new secondary coach. Shaun Wade, Amir Reep, Cameron Brown, you have Sevyn Banks. Not sure if Tyreek Johnson, where or if he fits in the equation, let alone, with any of the players coming in from the true freshman class that Ohio State's going to be welcoming in. So, yeah, the secondary is in flux. It's nice to know that they've got such talent in Shaun Wade that they can kind of exhale and believe, something, one cornerback slots in very capable hands.
Mm-hmm. So Jeffrey Okudah has declared for the draft. He is going to be leaving early, not a surprise. He's going to be perhaps a top 5 pick. I mean, he may be the first defensive back off the board in the NFL draft. Of course, Jordan Fuller has graduated. He has expended his eligibility, so those 2 spots are empty. Of course, Damon Arnett, the same as Fuller, used up his eligibility. He is out, and Chase Young also declared on January 3rd that he is going to go pro. Not a shock to either of us, but it would have been really cool if he came back.
Would have been really cool, but would have been dramatically surprising.
It would have been dramatically surprising. It's, he's going to go get paid. He's going to be probably the 2nd pick in the draft, and he's going to make a lot of money. So you can't really fault the kid for protecting himself and protecting that draft stock and going now. He doesn't have too much else to prove, I don't think, and I think he's going to make a lot of plays on Sundays moving forward. A couple of things we did note is that Baron Browning is going to be back. He has announced that he will be back, and also Justin Hilliard was awarded an extra year of eligibility due to his injury history. So not all bad. Ohio State will have some replacements on the football field on the defensive side of the ball, but I think largely this defense is in pretty good shape next year.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about the new secondary coach because it's not official yet. But yeah, I mean, I think Ohio State's defense, as you said a moment ago, I think it's in very good hands going into the 2020 season.
On the other side of the ball, the Buckeyes will have back 3 of the 5 offensive linemen are opting to return. That I think all of the underclassmen who were eligible to forego the rest of their eligibility all are returning.
Yeah, and that is something that I think most Ohio State fans probably kind of overlook because it's not a glamorous detail, but it's absolutely essential for the success of the offense.
So the leaving starters are transfer Jonah Jackson and Brandon Bowen.
Correct. And it should be the nice thing is Ohio State that they have recruited well in terms of with depth, and they've also supplemented throughout the season since they had so many lopsided victories that they've got some backups that are, I don't want to say that they're battle tested, but that they have earned playing time reps. So I think, they'll be able to supplement on that offensive line with, some players who have seen game action.
And punter Drew Chrisman announced that he will be back.
Which is probably the biggest news of all.
Yeah, I did see that a scout team offensive lineman announced that he's going to declare himself eligible for the draft. He was at Ohio State for 5 years, so I think
it was outstanding. It was outstanding. If you haven't had a chance to any of our listeners who do not, Kevin Wake's declaration, if you haven't had a chance to read it online, you're cheating yourself. Make sure you get an opportunity to take advantage of the opportunity to read Kevin Wake's declaration because it's gaining national recognition for its humor and he takes a lot of shots at himself. But all in good taste.
Yeah. All right, so you teased it a little bit, so let's talk about it. Ohio State has 2 openings on the coaching staff, or had 2 openings, with Jeff Hafley, of course, going to Boston College, and then Mike Yursich has decided to join Texas Tom down with the Texas Longhorns. And, I can only raise my eyebrows at Mike Yurkich's decision, that's hard to say, based on the fact that one more mediocre season and Texas probably cleans house. But he has decided this is what he wants to do. He's going to go call plays, so good for him. The Buckeyes did not waste any time replacing Yurkich, and they stayed in-house to do it. Ryan Day has elevated Corey Dennis to quarterbacks coach for the Ohio State coaching staff. He was a grad assistant, and this is a move that some people weren't crazy about. But, I think Ryan Day has an infallible record as a hirer of assistant coaches.
I'm going to give Ryan Day the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the Corey Dennis hire, simply because he's worked with that young man in a capacity over the last several years. He knows kind of what Corey Dennis, what his strengths are, where the opportunities for growth are. And a lot of people have kind of, speculated, that's the best you can do. Sometimes, as Ohio State showed by elevating Ryan Day internally, sometimes that's the best thing you can do. Instead of bringing in somebody from the outside who may have completely different ideas and thoughts from the head coach and the way he wants the program to be run. Corey Dennis is very familiar with the quarterbacks in that room, is very familiar with the way Ryan Day operates. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt for the elevation of Corey Dennis to the quarterback coach position.
Yeah, I don't think that Ryan Day has missed on a coach yet, so I don't see why anybody would be skeptical of this. I understand that maybe he's not the sexiest name to promote a grad assistant to that position, but Ryan Day is a quarterback coach himself. He's been there. He knows what goes on in that room. He's seen Corey Dennis, plenty of him. So he knows if he's ready or not, and he's decided Corey Dennis is ready to take on this role. It's something that Joe Burrow actually took to social media to applaud this move. And I think that if you don't trust Ryan Day, and I don't see why you wouldn't, do you not trust Joe Burrow?
Absolutely. And I think, that was something that Joe Burrow was under no obligation to do. So that was, just again, it just speaks to the quality individual that Joe Burrow is, which is why he has the whole state of Ohio pulling for him next week in the national championship game. But Corey Dennis, I have confidence that Ryan Day has done the right thing because he has worked with the young man. He knows what he wants in terms of how the quarterback's to be instructed, and I'm sure Corey Dennis is up to the task.
Yeah, I think so. So the other side of the ball, of course, Jeff Hafley has gone to Boston College. And the hot rumor is that the return of Kerry Combs is imminent. That we'll have to wait because the Tennessee Titans went up to New England and beat Tom Brady's Patriots, and they have continued their run in the AFC playoffs. But what do you think of the return of Kerry Combs to the Ohio State coaching staff?
Oh, I love it. Absolutely love it because Kerry Combs, besides his intense nature, he was somebody that I always loved prior to his departure to the NFL. Whenever there would be video clips of him talking with recruits about what they were trying to build within the program, and I think he is an excellent connection and relationship, if you will, to the Ohio high school coaches. The fact that Coach Combs has been a very successful high school coach in his own right down in Cincinnati Colerain before making the move into college and now the NFL. So I if it does come to pass, I really do think it's a tremendous move by Ryan Day. I think it will be certainly welcomed by the fans, because Coach Combs was a favorite of the fans while he was here, and his return to the Ohio State sideline would be certainly welcomed by me.
What do you make of the decision to go back to college after going to the NFL, and essentially he'd be back in the same old role that he had? I mean, he's good at it. Certainly, he knows he's a good recruiter, but what do you make of that decision? Do you think that he just misses college football? If he is assuming that all goes the way we think it's going to go, and he takes that position, do you think he just misses college football? Do you think the NFL isn't for him? Do you think it's too far from home? What do you think went into this decision, or goes into this decision?
Well, I think you hit some of it on the head. I think he would always pride himself on the fact that he was an Ohio guy. I mean, it wasn't until Urban Meyer lured him up to Columbus that he proudly proclaimed about his love of being from Cincinnati and being there his entire life. And so this is just pure speculation on my part, is that I believe that if the rumors are true that he does come back, that I think it's going to be a little bit more than what he did previously. I think he's actually going to get that co-defensive coordinator title that Jeff Hafley had. So maybe his roles and responsibilities are expanded. I also think, and this is just pure speculation on my part, is, we've been talking and surmising that Luke Fickell eventually, is going to move on to bigger and better things. Who wouldn't necessarily think that, okay, if Coach Combs does a good job for a season or two as the defensive back coach at Ohio State, that Cincinnati doesn't give him a chance to be the head coach there. I mean, I realize I'm putting a lot of speculation in those statements, but I'm just kind of, you asked me like why make the lateral move. I'm not so necessarily certain that it is a return, not even a lateral move, but a return to what he had done. I do think he was successful as a college coach. He's obviously been very good at the NFL level. I think he knows Ohio State, how that program is run. He's loved by the fans, by the Ohio high school coaches. I think it just checks a lot of boxes, and if it comes to pass, like I said, I will be very, very happy.
All right. Well, we'll see how that goes. At least he's a known commodity. Was the strength of the Buckeye coaching staff and the Buckeye recruiting efforts when he was here before. So I'm sure he'll bring that boundless energy that seems like he's intravenously taking Red Bull all day. He'll be fun to watch on the sidelines again. He'll bring all of that enthusiasm, excitement, adrenaline to the Buckeye coaching staff. I'm looking forward to seeing what Corey Dennis does. Of course, Ryan Day will continue to work with Kevin Wilson to be the primary play caller and to architect that offense. So I think that things are going well. It'll be interesting to see Ryan Day with the same quarterback for the second year in a row, which he hasn't had in his time at Ohio State with all the transitions and all the people that have left. So all of this is good for Ohio State. What else is good, Chip, for Ohio State is that the Buckeyes have 14 early enrollees from that freshman class that are already on campus. Julian Fleming, Jackson Smith-Njigba, G. Scott Jr., Mookie Cooper, Jack Miller, and C.J. Stroud, Paris Johnson Jr., Luke Wepler, and Trey LaRue, as well as Jacoby Cowan, Darian Henry Young. I'm butchering some of these guys' names. LaShawn Cavazos, Ryan Watts, and Court Williams.
Well, first of all, cut yourself some slack on the butchering of names, because it's not as though we have not necessarily been given the correct pronunciation guide from Jerry Emig yet. We haven't heard their names called yet. That's what the spring game is all for. So I if anything, I'm sure that I will make mistakes on pronunciation as well. But you did rattle off the fact that there are 14, and I'm just sitting here thinking, you and I can remember when, for example, Maurice Claret, that was that was a rare thing. And he was like the guy, like the one freshman who enrolled early, and it was, like how rare was that? And now to have 14 is going to just make spring football that much more interesting, because the way you started off with, rattling off wide receivers, that position group, when it comes to recruiting, is arguably the best wide receiver group that any school in the country signed this recruiting cycle. And Ohio State is the lucky beneficiaries of that. The quarterback battle is going to be something to keep an eye on, simply because, as you said, Justin Fields is back for his second year, but the strong speculation is this is probably his last year in Columbus. So one of those two players between Stroud and Miller could be the heir apparent for 2021, as well as the fact that they'll probably get some playing time in 2020, depending on how games shape out. A whole bunch of those guys, let's face it, when you are, along the offensive line, defensive line, the possible early impact is, okay, it's not necessarily high, but the accolades for Paris Johnson to possibly come in and be a contributor on that offensive line, there have certainly been strong rumblings that he has the capabilities of doing it. So as well as I do, when it comes to spring football, it's not something that most people get excited about. I certainly do, just because it's a glimpse into the future, maybe not even necessarily the immediate future, when it comes to like true freshmen, but you get a chance to see a lot of the people who were backup contributors get a chance to see what they might do when given the opportunity to be full-time starters in the fall.
Yeah, Gunnar Hoke will be the presumed backup quarterback going into the season, as Chris Chugunov has now exhausted his eligibility. The transfer from West Virginia has moved on. So if I had my way, Chugs would open a sports bar in Columbus and call it Chugs.
Well, maybe he's listening, and maybe that's what he's going to do after he gets his master's degree. You never know. I'm not sure. I'm glad that Ohio State has, in all fairness, that they have taken steps to try to improve the depth of the quarterback room. I'm ordinarily not one to push for signing 2 quarterbacks, but I think Ryan Day has demonstrated in his time in Columbus that he knows what he's doing at that most critical position on the field. And the fact that he saw enough from both players that he wanted 2 quarterbacks, the fact that he was, very instrumental in getting Gunnar Hoke last year. Like you said, Gunnar Hoke is the presumed backup unless one of these 2 young men overtakes him during the spring and summer. And, sometimes things happen. So it's going to be interesting, to say the least, at the quarterback position.
Yeah. Well, it will be cool to watch. I think the great thing about having this many guys in early is that they can get started on the weight training program quickly. They can start learning the offenses and the defenses right away and be much more prepared when the season starts. Remember, Gunnar Hoke came in, was several months behind and was never able to take over, the backup position from Chris Chugunov, who had been in the program for over a year. Even Justin Fields, it took him a while to get the entirety of the offense. I'm not even really sure that he made it through this season grasping the entirety of the offense, but he certainly didn't have it by the spring game. And that's about how much time you have to prepare for the season if you don't enroll until the fall and arrive on campus for preseason camp.
Yeah, I think in fairness to Gunnar Hoke, I think you nailed it, that coming in the summer, and he was a welcome addition. I don't want to sound that he wasn't, but coming in the summer, he was definitely behind and never could close the gap between he and Chris Chugunov. And I think in the spring game, whenever it is announced, that I wouldn't be surprised if his performance in the spring game is much better than what we saw during the regular season because of that increased comfort level with the offense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And it's just great that these kids are coming in early. It will give guys like Paris Johnson a chance to get playing time his first year. I mean, he may not end up being the starter, but I could see him getting reps at right tackle, and I could see him taking, if he's as good as expected, that he could be that number 2 guy entering the season on the depth chart. And if that's the case, he's certainly going to get some playing time. And that's even if the starter stays healthy, he still should get into some games and get some meaningful snaps. So all of this is, is good for Ohio State. I think that the fact that they only lost 2 position coaches is good. And they were able to fill those with people that they trusted and people they liked and fill them rather quickly. I think all of this is really good for Ryan Day. Having a second year with Justin Fields is going to be good. So I'm going to go into the spring with a lot of optimism, and if we can, if we don't get any bad off-season news, then I think we'll enter 2020 with a team that's very, very hungry. I think a team that will be out to prove that last year wasn't a fluke and that they, probably should have done better than they actually did, which was pretty impressive in itself. And, the outlook is very, very good for the 2020 Buckeyes.
I think you hit it squarely and solidly out of the park with everything you just said.
All right, Chip, before we sign off until the spring game, is there anything else you want to discuss about the 2019 season?
Something, and this is something I'm sure that you agree with because we always, you sometimes allude to it throughout the course of the season is that it's a shame that it's over because, it goes by so fast. We're already so, speaking for myself, eagerly anticipating the spring game and the contributions of true freshmen and, who's emerging and all those kind of things. And it's like just the build up, the anticipation, can't wait. And then the season gets here and in the blink of an eye, it's gone. So it was a tremendous season. I've said it before. I'll just reiterate it. Certainly didn't end the way I would have liked, but I loved it all the same. Look forward to the reports coming out of winter conditioning and everything. And I'm sure that we'll get together prior to the spring game to kind of assess, what we think is going to happen and obviously do a breakdown on the spring game because that's something that I certainly make every effort. I can't promise. It just depends on when it's announced. Because we talk about with my family and my kids' activities and stuff, like if there's like a track meet that same day, I'm not sure if my sons will. I mean, maybe they'd understand. You know, they know their dad's sickness, but you know, that's the kind of thing when it comes to, you know, like not knowing when the spring game is yet officially. It clouds knowing if I'm going to be there in attendance, but I'm certainly that's certainly my intention if I can.
Sounds good. That will pretty much do it then. We don't have any mail for the mailbag this week. If you do want to send us something, some off-season questions for us to answer, please do that. You can hit us up on Twitter with the hashtag SBPmailbag. And you can hit me up. I'm at Mike36Fan, and Chip is at Chip Minnick, Minnich is the spelling of the last name. So hit us up. One of us, both of us, doesn't matter, with the hashtag SBP mailbag. At least if you use the hashtag, we can do a search and find the question that way. Maybe we'll get ourselves a mailbox, via email set up for questions for next year too. That way it'll be easier for those of you who do not do the Twitters, and you can hit us up that way. And we'll be happy to answer those questions. But Chip, it's been fun being with you for a second season. I look forward to a third. You hit the nail right on the head, as you so often say to me, when you said that the off season is a long, long thing, and then the season goes by in a blink. It really seems like we just did our season predictions. That's the only reason I could remember things like, you know, what we talked about before the season started, and the fact that, you know, we saw Nebraska as a potential upset loss, or that dreaded Western Division loss, and some of those things, and how we thought Northwestern on the road was going to be a brawl, and some of those things that ended up looking kind of silly in retrospect. But it really does seem like it goes by very quickly. That was 14 games in 17, 18 weeks, and it just feels like it just zoomed by like you're trackside at the Indy 500 and looking straight ahead, and you don't even see the car. It goes by so fast.
Well, it's been a pleasure recording these with you. Like I look forward to resuming in the spring. Hopefully, we will. I guess as the Ohio quotient of the team, hopefully the winter weather will not be as brutal. Because I know you have to really tough it out down there in Florida and everything. But seriously, it's great recording these. I'm glad that we have an audience of Ohio State fans who enjoy listening to them. Don't be shy, like you said a moment ago, about hitting us up on Twitter or asking us questions, even if we're not going to have a show until closer to the spring game. Look forward to the 2020 season. I'm missing it already, like you said, because it went by so fast.
Yeah, and the other thing too is if something happened, if there were some big news that you and I would, we would reconvene for an impromptu show. In the meantime, it wouldn't necessarily be until spring, the spring game. Obviously we would hope that it was breaking news on the good side and not the bad side. But if that happened, certainly if something were to happen to warrant us, getting together and doing a show in the off season, an unscheduled one, we would do that because we do enjoy doing these. It's just that between now and the spring game, you and me not being the recruitniks that some of our brethren are, there's not that much news for us to talk about.
No, there really isn't, and I freely admit I'm not nearly as partial to college basketball as you are, and even as somebody who played sparingly in junior high and high school, my basketball skills were never really, that much to write home about. So, this is the sport that I'm most passionate about. Now that it's kind of taking a little bit of a hiatus, the only thing I'm envious about is, I think people, that they should take a clue from the bears and, go hibernate in the caves or something, until until the winter is done. But unfortunately, that's not possible. So just gotta hope that winter goes by quickly and easily, and we can get back to talking about Ohio State football in the spring. Like you said, hopefully, there's no breaking news that kind of forces us to have an impromptu show.
Yeah, you could be like the beloved Chicago Bears of Tony Gerdeman and hibernate for the playoffs.
Oh, now you're getting nasty.
All right, Chip, that will do it for this episode of the Silver Bullets podcast. We'll reconvene for the spring game, and if necessary before then. But until then, we'll plan to have our next show centered around the spring game. Again, get those questions into us. You have off-season questions. You want to know about the depth chart. You want to know about some of the transfer portal stuff that's going on. Whatever you want to know, just give us a holler on Twitter with the hashtag SBP mailbag, and hit us up at Mike36fan and or at Chip Minnick, Minnich. Chip, where else can people find you on the internet?
They can find me on as a contributor to Athlon Sports. Occasionally during the off season, believe it or not, Athlon will ask me to write something Ohio State related. And during the college football season, GERD graciously allows me to have a column or so every so often on the Hayes and Cannon section of the ozone.net.
Yep, you can find me at Hayes and Cannon as well, the ozone.net Hayes and Cannon section. I probably won't write a whole lot in the off season, if at all, but you can go back and find my grumpy old Buckeye columns if you haven't read them, and go back and relive those games through that lens of what is generally a tongue-in-cheek look at everything that went wrong in games that pretty much otherwise went really, really well for Ohio State, especially when you're talking about that 71-point win earlier in the year. And you can check out some of my other writing at michaellikestowrite.com, and I appreciate your feedback there as well. Thank you to everybody who listened to us again this season. Please listen to our sister shows on the the Ozone Radio Network, rather. Buckeye Weekly with Tony Gerdeman and Tom Orr. They'll go a couple times a week. That'll probably go down to once a week, plus their Patreon show. They have subscribers. If you join their Patreon, you get an extra special secret show where they talk about all the good stuff that they don't talk about on their regular show. And you listen to the Buckeye Sloopcast as well. And so those guys, between those two shows, you're going to hear a lot more about the recruiting aspects that Chip and I don't cover extensively. So be sure to give them a look and read our stuff on the ozone.net, because it's a great site. It's very informative, and those guys work really hard for you. So they would appreciate the clicks and your eyeballs on their stories. That's going to do it for this episode, like I mentioned before, but it's for real this time. Signing off until the spring game, Chip. Maybe I'll come up and see it with you if you're going. But if
that sounds
not,
good.
If not, we will talk again right around that time. So, go Bucks!
Go Bucks!